Here is a fact that nobody tells you in history class. The single greatest threat to every human settlement in history, from the first Paleolithic camp to the grandest Roman city, was not war, not famine, not predators, not rival tribes. It was their own waste. Specifically, the catastrophic, civilization-ending, population-collapsing consequences of not knowing what to do with it. Or knowing what to do with it and then not doing that. Or doing that but doing it badly. Or doing it well for a while and then getting complacent about it, because the smell became normal and the deaths seemed unrelated. This is the story that sits underneath every story of ancient human civilization. The unglamorous, awkward, profoundly important question of where exactly everyone went to the bathroom, what happened after, and what it tells us about how intelligent human beings were, how adaptive they were, and how many of them died learning lessons that we now take for granted. And look, this is going to get a little uncomfortable. Not because the material is particularly shocking, but because the more you know about it, the more you realize that the thin membrane of infrastructure between modern civilization and the consequences of its own biology is considerably thinner than most people ever think about. Let's start at the very beginning. Picture a Paleolithic band. 20 people, maybe 30, moving across a landscape that has never seen a permanent human structure. They camp for a few days, maybe a week, near a water source or a hunting ground, and then they move on. For these people, waste management was, in a technical sense, solved by the movement itself. The camp was temporary. The waste stayed behind. By the time any pathogen in that waste had cycled through the soil and water into a form dangerous enough to recontaminate the group was already somewhere else, camped near a different water source, leaving different waste behind. The natural decomposition cycle of the environment, microbes, insects, scavengers, soil chemistry, was given enough time and space to process what the humans left before the humans returned. This is not a primitive or inadequate solution. It is an elegant one, and it is essentially the same solution used by every other large animal in the ecosystem. Elephants do not build latrines. Birds do not establish sewage systems. Wolves do not have municipal sanitation departments. Every mobile animal produces waste and moves on, and the ecosystem handles the rest. The Paleolithic human doing this was not being careless or unhygienic in any meaningful sense. They were operating within the waste management capacity of the natural environment, distributing their biological output across a landscape large enough to absorb it without accumulating to dangerous concentrations. The problems began, as so many human problems begin, when people stopped moving. Agriculture changed everything about the human relationship with waste, and it changed it fast enough that the adaptations required to manage the consequences were constantly lagging behind the scale of the problem. When humans settled permanently near their fields, they also settled permanently near their waste. The quantity of waste generated by a settled community accumulates. A band of 20 nomads spread their output across hundreds of square kilometers of territory across a year. A settled village of 200 people concentrated their output within a few hundred meters of their water supply, their food storage, their children's play areas, and their sleeping spaces, every single day, indefinitely. The earliest archaeological evidence of human waste management practices comes from exactly this period, the transition to settled agricultural life. And what it reveals is that some ancient humans understood the problem with remarkable clarity, while others absolutely did not. And the difference between those two groups is measurable in their health outcomes, their population survival rates, and the longevity of their settlements. At Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic settlement in modern Turkey dating to roughly 9,000 years ago, one of the earliest and largest settled communities ever excavated, archaeologists found evidence of communal midden areas, designated zones outside the residential spaces where organic waste was deposited. The physical separation of living spaces from waste accumulation zones was intentional and maintained across the settlement's existence. The people of Çatalhöyük had, without any formal theory of germ transmission, arrived empirically at the conclusion that keeping waste away from living spaces was a good idea worth enforcing as a community norm. They also, fascinatingly, had significant health problems from parasites and intestinal pathogens, problems that isotopic analysis of skeletal remains reveals in detail. The midden system was better than nothing. Considerably better than randomness, but not as effective as the full separation that nomadic movement had previously provided. Settled life was already creating a disease burden that nomadic life had not faced. The humans were adapting, but the pathogens were adapting faster. The question of where exactly people went, physically, in the act, is one that archaeologists have investigated with more ingenuity and considerably more dedication than the topic might suggest. In many Paleolithic and early Neolithic contexts, the answer appears to be somewhere outside the main living area, in no particularly organized location, based on opportunity and the path of least resistance. The practice of walking some distance from camp or settlement to defecate, leaving space between the act and the living space, appears in the behavioral patterns of numerous indigenous populations with low contact with modern sanitation, and is inferred from archaeological site layouts that show clean living areas surrounded by organic-rich peripheral zones. The distance chosen was not random. Ethnographic research on contemporary hunter-gatherer and traditional communities consistently shows a rough minimum distance maintained between sleeping areas and waste deposition, regardless of the culture or geography. This minimum distance, typically well outside the immediate sensory range of the camp, downwind of prevailing breezes, away from water sources, represents a body of empirical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of observation. Staying close to waste made people sick. Moving away from it reduced sickness. Nobody needed a microscope to figure this out. The correlation between contaminated living spaces and illness was observable at the scale of individual communities across individual seasons. The communities that internalized and enforced the behavioral norm of distance survived better than those that didn't. The norm was adaptive, and adaptive norms in social species tend to persist and propagate. The more complex question is what ancient humans used for wiping, cleaning, and managing the personal hygiene component of the process. A question that is simultaneously more answerable than most people expect, and more varied than any single answer can capture. Leaves were the near universal default wherever adequate vegetation existed. Not random leaves. Communities with generations of local ecological knowledge knew which plants had the right texture, the right size, the right structural integrity for the purpose, and which were irritating, toxic, or simply inadequate. Specific plant materials appear in ethnographic records across cultures as traditional hygiene materials, often with accompanying knowledge of which plants to avoid and why. Water was used across many cultures, particularly in warmer climates, a practice that has persisted into the modern world across South Asia, the Middle East, and numerous other regions where water-based cleaning has always been considered more hygienic than dry alternatives. The bidet, which Europeans invented in the 17th century and then refused to embrace for approximately 300 years due to cultural stubbornness, is simply a mechanized version of what a significant portion of humanity has been doing with a vessel of water since before recorded history. Snow in cold climate environments, sand in arid ones, shells, smooth stones, moss, grass, corn cobs. The archaeological and ethnographic record is a remarkable catalog of human ingenuity, applied to an unavoidable biological necessity with whatever materials happened to be locally abundant. The Roman communal sponge on a stick, shared between users at public latrines, and rinsed in running water or vinegar between uses, a detail of Roman sanitation that tends to produce strong reactions when modern people encounter it for the first time, was at least better than several available alternatives, even if it falls considerably short of modern hygienic ideals. The Romans deserve their own extended treatment in this story, because Roman sanitation represents one of the most sophisticated and simultaneously most misunderstood waste management systems in the ancient world. The Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, is one of the oldest continuously functioning infrastructure works in human history. Originally constructed in the 6th century BCE to drain the marshy ground of the Roman Forum, and eventually developed into a network of underground channels serving the growing city. Rome at its height had public latrines, running water supplied by an extraordinary aqueduct system, and a general understanding that waste management was an infrastructure problem requiring engineering solutions rather than merely personal behavioral choices. The public latrines of Rome, latrina from the Latin for bath or washroom, were communal affairs that would thoroughly unsettle most modern users. Rows of adjacent seats over channels of running water, used simultaneously by multiple people with no privacy partitions and apparently no social awkwardness about the arrangement. Conversation was normal, business was conducted, the latrine was a social space in a way that has essentially no modern equivalent, which says something interesting about the relationship between culture and bodily function that probably deserves more philosophical attention than it receives. But here is the complication that often gets lost in the celebration of Roman engineering. The Cloaca Maxima was designed as a drainage system, not a sewage treatment system. It moved waste from the city into the Tiber River, which then moved it downstream. This solved the immediate problem of waste accumulation within the city at the cost of creating a substantial downstream contamination problem. The Tiber was simultaneously Rome's sewer outlet and, in various stretches, a source of water for communities downstream. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The germ theory of disease that would have allowed Romans to understand why this was catastrophic was approximately 1800 years in the future. The Romans also used human waste as fertilizer. Urine in particular was collected for its ammonia content and used in the fulling of wool and in tanning. Urine collection vessels were placed on street corners, collected by fullers who paid a tax on the collection. A tax instituted by the Emperor Vespasian, who, when criticized for taxing something so undignified, reportedly held a coin to his son's nose and observed that money smelled fine regardless of its source. The resulting Latin phrase, pecunia non olet, money has no smell, entered the language as an idiom, and eventually, much later, gave us the word pecuniary. Roman sanitation was sophisticated by ancient standards and lethal by modern ones. Gastrointestinal disease was a constant, endemic presence in Roman urban populations. Intestinal parasites infected the majority of the population. The lead pipes carrying water that the Romans were so proud of were slowly poisoning a civilization, while the sewage system that impressed visiting provincials was conducting pathogens into the water supply with an efficiency that no ancient city fully appreciated. The contrast between Roman urban sanitation and some contemporary civilizations is striking in ways that conventional historical narratives often overlook. The Indus Valley civilization, centered in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, flourishing between approximately 3,300 and 1300 BCE, built waste management infrastructure that, by some measures, surpassed anything Rome would later construct. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had covered drainage systems running beneath the streets, collecting waste from individual houses through connections to a citywide network. Individual homes had washrooms and what appear to be early toilet facilities draining directly into the sewer system. The Indus Valley sewers were not just drainage channels. They were covered, maintained, and accessed through manholes for cleaning, the same basic design principles that underlie modern urban sewer systems. The scale and sophistication of this infrastructure in a civilization that predates Rome by over a millennium represents an engineering achievement that was not matched or exceeded in Europe for thousands of years. Why the Indus Valley civilization developed this infrastructure when other contemporary civilizations did not is a question that archaeology cannot fully answer. What it demonstrates is that the knowledge required to build effective sewage infrastructure was not dependent on any particular scientific understanding. It was the product of empirical observation and the social organization required to implement and maintain engineering works at a civic scale. The Indus Valley people may not have known what a bacterium was, but they had observed enough correlation between waste management practices and population health to justify an extraordinary investment in infrastructure. Ancient Crete, the Minoan civilization, similarly developed sophisticated drainage and water management systems, including what appear to be flush toilets in the palace complex at Knossos, where water was channeled through the facility to carry waste away. Whether these were widely available or limited to elite palace contexts is debated, but their existence in the 2nd millennium BCE represents sanitation technology that most of Europe would not see again for 3,000 years. Medieval Europe is often held up as the cautionary tale of what happens when sanitation knowledge degrades. And the tale is, if anything, understated. The Roman infrastructure that had served urban populations across Europe fell into disrepair and eventually ruin as the empire contracted and the administrative capacity to maintain large engineering works dissolved. The sewage systems silted up, the aqueducts stopped flowing. The urban populations that remained in formerly Roman cities reverted to practices that were, in some cases, dramatically worse than what their predecessors had managed. The streets of medieval European cities were, by multiple contemporary accounts, extraordinary in their filth. Chamber pots emptied from upper windows into the street below. The traditional warning cry of "Garde l'eau," corrupted in English to the still-used exclamation "Gardez-l'eau," were a standard feature of urban living. The narrow streets accumulated organic material that rain might partially clear toward the gutters running along the center or edges, but that between rains constituted a surface condition that modern sanitation inspectors would not permit even in agricultural facilities. Animals, pigs, chickens, horses, dogs, moved through the same streets, adding their contribution to the accumulation. Butchers and tanners operated in residential areas, their waste joining the general organic matter of the urban environment. Rivers flowing through cities received not just storm runoff, but the direct discharge of latrines, slaughterhouses, tanneries, and everything else the city generated, and then provided water that downstream populations drank. The consequences were measurable and catastrophic. Waterborne disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, was endemic in medieval European cities in a way that kept urban mortality rates chronically high. Cities of the medieval period were, in demographic terms, net population sinks. They consumed people faster than their resident populations could replace themselves through reproduction, and maintained their size only through continuous immigration from rural areas where lower population density kept disease transmission rates somewhat more manageable. The Black Death, which killed between a third and half of Europe's population in the 14th century, was caused by Yersinia. Pest is transmitted primarily by fleas on rats, but the conditions that allowed it to spread with such catastrophic speed were the same conditions that allowed every other epidemic disease of the period to flourish: dense populations, inadequate waste management, contaminated water supplies, and limited understanding of the connection between sanitation and disease transmission. Traditional cultures outside the European urban context often managed waste with considerably more sophistication than the medieval European model, and examining their practices reveals the depth of empirical knowledge that communities accumulate over generations of observation. Many indigenous North American communities practiced strict spatial organization of settlements that separated waste areas from living and food preparation areas, maintained downwind and downhill positioning of latrines relative to water sources, and used covering of waste with soil as a standard practice that, without any knowledge of microbiology, substantially reduces pathogen survival and transmission. The practice of covering waste with earth is one of the most effective simple interventions in sanitation, and it appears independently across numerous cultures that arrived at it through pure observation of outcomes. Many of the same cultures also practiced field sanitation, the application of human waste as fertilizer to agricultural land, but with practices that in some cases included composting periods that reduced pathogen loads before field application. The knowledge that fresh waste applied to food crops caused illness while aged waste did not was empirical knowledge earned through generations of observation, and the cultural transmission of that knowledge as agricultural practice saved lives without anyone understanding the microbiology behind it. East Asian agricultural traditions, particularly in China and Japan, developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for collecting, transporting, aging, and applying human waste as agricultural fertilizer. Practices that sustained agricultural productivity on the same land for millennia without the soil degradation that characterized European agricultural practices. The night soil collectors who served urban populations in pre-modern China and Japan were not figures of low social status performing an unimportant function. They were providing a critical service that maintained the fertility of agricultural land, and, through the economic transaction involved, creating an incentive structure for urban sanitation that reduced waste accumulation in populated areas. This system, sometimes called the Asian sanitation model by agricultural historians, maintained soil productivity in densely populated agricultural regions for thousands of years, in ways that European agriculture, which did not systematically recycle human waste back to the land, could not match. The trade-off was exposure to the pathogens in insufficiently treated waste, which created disease burdens in these populations as well. but the agricultural productivity benefits were real and sustained. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that microscopic organisms cause infection and that sanitation practices reduce disease transmission by reducing pathogen exposure, arrived in the mid-19th century and transformed waste management from an empirical practice into a scientific discipline. But here's the thing worth sitting with. Before germ theory existed, humans had already figured out most of the right answers. They had figured out that waste should be kept away from living spaces, that it should be kept away from water supplies, that it should be buried or otherwise covered, that distance from waste correlated with health, that certain practices produced sickness and others prevented it. They had figured all of this out the hard way, by observation, by trial and error, by cultural transmission of accumulated knowledge, by the brutal selection pressure of communities that got it wrong, dying at higher rates than communities that got it right. The knowledge preceded the explanation by thousands of years. The practice preceded the theory. Ancient humans handling their waste with the sophistication that some of them did were not doing so because they understood bacteria. They were doing so because their communities had survived long enough and observed carefully enough to know that certain practices kept people alive, and others did not. This is, in a sense, the most remarkable thing about the story of ancient human waste management. Not the failures, the medieval cities drowning in their own effluent, the Roman sewers poisoning the Tiber, the Neolithic settlements accumulating parasite loads that their nomadic ancestors never faced. Those failures are comprehensible. Waste management at civic scale is hard, and the consequences of getting it wrong are not always immediately or obviously connected to the practices causing them. The remarkable thing is the successes. The Indus Valley engineers building covered sewers 4,000 years ago. The indigenous communities maintaining strict spatial separation of waste and water sources without any formal theory of why it mattered. The traditional farmers of East Asia sustaining agricultural fertility across millennia by cycling waste back to soil, in ways that took European agriculture centuries longer to systematize. These people were solving one of the hardest problems in human civilization, managing the biological output of dense human populations without destroying the environment those populations depended on, with observation, ingenuity, and the slow accumulation of empirical knowledge across generations. They were, in the terms that matter most, doing science, without the formal apparatus of science, without the theoretical framework, without the institutional support, with nothing but the feedback of outcomes observed across lifetimes and transmitted across generations. And in many cases, they were doing it remarkably well. The lesson is not that ancient humans were primitive and we have improved. The lesson is that the problems were real, the stakes were absolute, the intelligence applied was genuine, and the accumulated knowledge of generations, even when wrong about the mechanisms, was often right about the practices. Wash your hands, protect your water supply, keep your waste far from where you eat and sleep. 4,000 years of painful empirical learning. Still good advice. Possibly the best advice anyone has ever given when you follow the history all the way back to where it started.